Hidden away in the quiet town of Christchurch once stood one of the most important military research establishments Britain ever built. A place where bridges were launched across tidal channels under simulated combat conditions, where strange experimental vehicles clawed their way through marshland and mudflats, and where engineers and scientists quietly helped shape the future of modern warfare. This was the Military Engineering Experimental Establishment, better known simply as MEXE. And despite influencing everything from Allied operations in the Second World War to Britain's Cold War military capability, unless you have a particular interest in military engineering history, there's a good chance you've never heard of them. Which is odd, because if you've ever driven across a temporary bridge, watched footage of Allied troops advancing through Europe in the Second World War, or even seen engineers assessing whether a centuries-old bridge can safely carry modern traffic, there's a good chance that MEXE had something to do with it. So today, we're uncovering the forgotten history of Britain's secret military engineering establishment. The origins of MEXE can be traced back to the aftermath of the First World War. By 1918, militaries around the world had learned a brutal lesson. Modern warfare had become industrial. Wars were no longer won by firepower alone. Victory depended just as much on engineering, logistics, and mobility. Armies needed roads capable of carrying tanks through shattered landscapes. They needed bridges strong enough to support artillery and supply convoys. They needed transport networks, communication systems, and portable infrastructure. And crucially, they needed the ability to move enormous quantities of men and machinery across terrain that had often been reduced to mud and ruin. And during the First World War, armies had repeatedly struggled to do exactly that. And so, in 1919, the Royal Engineers established the Experimental Bridging Company in Christchurch. The location was ideal for military experimentation. Christchurch offered sheltered tidal waters, open ground for vehicle testing, easy access to rivers and coastal environments, and close proximity to existing military infrastructure along the south coast. What began as a relatively modest bridging unit quickly evolved into something far more ambitious. By 1925, it had become the Experimental Bridging Establishment, and its mission was deceptively simple: solve battlefield engineering problems before the next war arrived. But the next war came far sooner than anyone expected. If MEXE is remembered for one achievement above all others, it is undoubtedly the Bailey Bridge. Designed during the Second World War by civil servant and engineer Sir Donald Bailey, legend has it that the original concept was first sketched on the back of an envelope during a car journey. Now, if you're not especially interested in military engineering, a bridge may not sound all that revolutionary, but the Bailey Bridge absolutely was. The brilliance of its design lay in its simplicity. Previous military bridging systems were often cumbersome, heavy and dependent on specialist equipment. Constructing them could take days, if not weeks. Bailey's design completely changed that. The bridge consisted of modular steel panels that could be bolted together in sections by ordinary soldiers in the field, without cranes or heavy machinery. The components were standardised, prefabricated, and relatively cheap to manufacture, a critical advantage during wartime Britain, when speed of production mattered just as much as engineering sophistication. Sections could be transported by lorry, carried by manpower, assembled beside a riverbank, and then launched outwards across a gap using rollers. And it meant entire bridges could sometimes be erected in a matter of hours. The impact on Allied operations was enormous. The Allies used Bailey bridges absolutely everywhere. North Africa, Italy, France, Burma, Germany, basically anywhere where troops were advancing faster than permanent bridges could be repaired. Bailey bridges became the solution. One of the most famous examples was the Blackfriars Bridge across the Rhine, which stretched an astonishing 558 metres. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later wrote, "Bailey bridging made an immense contribution towards ending World War II. As far as my own operations were concerned, I could never have maintained the speed and tempo of forward movement without large supplies of Bailey bridging. Without the Bailey Bridge, we should not have won the war. It was the best thing in that line that we ever had." Even Eisenhower reportedly considered the Bailey Bridge one of the three most important technological developments of the entire war, alongside radar and the heavy bomber. Between 1942 and 1945, Britain produced an estimated 490,000 tonnes of Bailey Bridge components. Perhaps even more remarkable is the fact that some of these are still in civilian use today. In fact, there's still a Bailey Bridge right here in Christchurch at Stampit Marsh, where the original 1941 prototype once stood, which means one of the most influential military engineering systems ever invented is now mostly crossed by dog walkers. After the Second World War, Britain faced an entirely new military reality. The age of mechanised warfare had arrived in full, and now governments also had to consider the terrifying implications of the atomic age. And so in 1946, The establishment officially became the Military Engineering Experimental Establishment. And by this stage, its responsibilities extended far beyond bridging alone. MEXE became responsible for an enormous range of military engineering research. Military vehicles, battlefield mobility, terrain analysis, portable roads, earth-moving equipment, demolition systems, amphibious engineering, floating rafts, assault crossings, and logistics infrastructure. At its height, the establishment became one of Britain's most important defence research centres, and much of the work carried out there was highly secretive. Christchurch itself effectively became an enormous outdoor laboratory. The surrounding marshes, tidal channels, mudflats, and unstable coastal terrain allowed engineers to simulate many of the difficult conditions armies might face overseas. Experimental vehicles churned through mud, portable roadways were laid across unstable ground, bridging systems were tested in tidal water, and heavy military equipment was pushed deliberately to destruction in order to understand its limits. Much of the testing took place behind heavy security or under the cover of darkness. Locals would occasionally glimpse bizarre military machines moving through the surrounding area, but they rarely knew exactly what they were witnessing. By the 1950s and 60s, MEXE had become deeply embedded within Britain's Cold War defence planning, and it was not operating in isolation. With nearby establishments including the Signals Research and Development Establishment and the Radar Research and Development Establishment. For a time, Christchurch became one of the most technologically important military towns in Britain. And unlike a conventional military site, many of the people working there were not soldiers at all. They were scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and civilian researchers. The work they carried out was often invisible to the public, yet it directly influenced how NATO armies intended to fight a future war in Europe. One of MEXE's most unexpected legacies survives today not on the battlefield but in civil engineering. It became known as the MEXE method. At first glance, it sounds insignificant, but it solved an enormously important military challenge, because NATO had a problem. During the Cold War, tanks kept getting heavier, but Europe's bridges were often extremely old. Some dated back hundreds of years, and many had incomplete records. And if you're planning military operations involving 50-ton vehicles, it looks sturdy enough is not a particularly reassuring engineering standard. Before MEXE's work, engineers often relied on rough estimates or dangerous physical testing, but the MEXE method changed that. Instead of driving heavier and heavier vehicles over a bridge until it failed, by analysing the shape of a bridge, the materials used in its construction, its condition, thickness, and the way weight distributed itself across the structure, engineers could mathematically estimate the load a bridge could safely carry. Even today, despite all the advancements in modern engineering software, structural engineers still reference principles derived from the MEXE method when assessing older bridges. On the 6th of May 1969, MEXE received the freedom of the borough of Christchurch. This was an extraordinary honour. Military regiments and corps often receive the freedom of a town or a city, but MEXE became the first and only experimental establishment to ever be granted that distinction. By that point, MEXE had become deeply tied to the local community. Generations of Christchurch families had worked there, and the establishment brought highly skilled scientific and engineering employment into the town for decades. For much of the 20th century, this quiet stretch of coastline had quietly helped shape military engineering across the world. But it wouldn't last forever. By the late 1960s, Britain's defence priorities were beginning to shift. Budget cuts, restructuring, and changing strategic priorities began reshaping the country's military research network. In 1970, MEXE was merged with the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey to form the new Military Vehicles and Engineering Establishment. The decision caused major concern locally. Parliamentary debates later described Christchurch residents as shocked by the scale of the reductions. Around 400 jobs were lost. Some employees were offered positions elsewhere at Chertsey, many were not. And over the following decades, repeated reorganisations gradually dismantled what remained of the original establishment. The Military Vehicles and Engineering Establishment became part of the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment in the 1980s, and then the Defence Research Agency in 1991, and later still the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency in 1995. By then, the Christchurch site itself had already closed, and the age of MEXE was over. Today, much of the original site has disappeared beneath redevelopment. You can drive through Christchurch without ever realising that some of Britain's most important military engineering work once happened here. But traces still remain. A Bailey Bridge still stands at Sandpit Marsh. A commemorative section of bridging is displayed beside Christchurch Retail Park, near the site where the bridges were once designed and manufactured. Technical reports and engineering archives still survive within the National Archives, and scattered around the town are other reminders that Christchurch once shaped military engineering across the world, helping to solve one of warfare's oldest problems. How do you actually get an army from one side of a river to the other? The strange thing about places like MEXE is that they rarely become famous. There are no dramatic battlefield charges, no blockbuster war films about bridge load calculations or portable road systems, no victory parades for experimental engineering establishments. But the truth is, modern warfare depends on logistics, mobility, and infrastructure just as much as weapons. And for decades, some of Britain's most important military innovations emerged not from Whitehall or Westminster, but here in Christchurch. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and to National Lottery players who have made this video and videos like this possible.